Hi there, everyone. I want to start by welcome you all, wherever you are and at whatever time it is, to our event that's hosted by the journal Ethics in International Affairs, the journal of the Carnegie Council. My name's Tony Lang. I'm a professor in the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Let me start just by apologizing for the slight delay. We had a little technical difficulties, but we're all ready to go with our conversation this morning. So let me I'll say a couple things just to introduce the panel, which was brought together based on some themes in an essay that one of our panelists, Joy Gordon, and I wrote that appeared as an online exclusive in Ethics in International Affairs in January 2023. And this panel, Making Ethics More Global, has been organized in part as well in celebration of the 10th annual Global Ethics Day, which is going to take place on October 18th. Over the last 10 years, thousands of organizations and individuals from over 100 countries have participated in this annual moment to empower ethics. And we'd encourage everyone watching to join this year's Global Ethics Day celebrations, and there'll be a link to that shared in the chat that you can click on. So before I introduce our terrific group of panelists here, let me say something briefly about the point of this panel. You know, for ethics to be truly global, voices from around the world need to be part of the conversation. And as these conversations still often begin in Western publishing houses and take place in global North classrooms, the academic world still must be sure that global South perspectives are heard, welcomed, and celebrated. Some questions could be, what are some structures and systems that need to be re-examined or broken? And what does a more diverse and inclusive approach to knowledge production look like? Now, the Carnegie Council and the journal itself has sought to encourage this in its own way over the years. And do a little show and tell here. I've got in front of me the very first edition of Ethics in International Affairs. It looks very different than what it looks like today. And in its very first issue, there was an article by the Kenyan scholar and activist Ali Mazrui, in which he pointed out how superpower, this was written in 1987, how superpower ethics, at the time that was the US and Soviet Union, hasn't really benefited countries such as his own, to put it mildly. He had a much milder way of putting that. We might be putting it more strongly today. And this was an early effort, I think, by the Council to bring a global South voice to bear on the conversations. Now, of course, it was about superpower ethics. So that suggests that the Council was only kind of getting there, right? In 1987 was a different time than 2023. But it was in moving itself in the right direction. And I think this panel, hopefully, is a great example of how the Council and all of us are trying to move ourselves to think more critically about what ethics is and where it comes from. Okay, so that's kind of what origins of this is. And I'm gonna probably do less of the speaking, I'm gonna do more of the moderating. So let me briefly introduce our panelists. Now, we've got, there's three you can see on the screen here. We have an additional person who's having some technical difficulties connecting. We may be able to bring him on board, we're not sure. But let me introduce those who you can see right now. First, Dr. May Darwish is an associate professor in international relations of the Middle East at the University of Birmingham. And she's the author of Threats and Alliances in the Middle East, Saudi and Syrian Policies in a Turbulent Region. And her research attempts to bring Middle East cases to debates with international relations theory. And she's got a wide range of other publications touching on some similar issues. Dr. Joy Gordon is a professor of philosophy at Loyola University Chicago, and her work focuses on human rights and economic rights, particularly economic sanctions. She's the author of Invisible War, the United States and the Iraq Sanctions, and along with me, authored the short piece I mentioned, Making Global Ethics More Global, and as well as an editor with me of a book series that's seeking to promote voices from the Global South. Dr. Raul Salgado is a research professor at Flaxo in Ecuador. He has worked as an advisor at the City Council in Bonn and the National Assembly in Ecuador. His research focuses on foreign policy and diplomacy, with an emphasis on Latin America and the role of small states in regional and global institutions. Now, our fourth panelist, let me just mention, is Reverend Charles Chilufya, a Jesuit priest working for the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar as a director of the Justice and Ecology Office since 2018. And in this role, he fosters and coordinates the Jesuits' work in economic, social, migration, juvenile, gender, and climate justice across Africa. As I said, Charlie's having a little difficulty connecting with us. Hopefully we can get him on board later. We'll just have to wait and see how that goes. So what I did in advance is sent to each panelist a brief question, maybe to get their thinking moving. It's not something I want to have anybody confined to, but I'll remind our panelists of the question that I sent to them. And each panelist is going to take 5 to 7 minutes just to lay out some thoughts on this wider issue of making global ethics more global, maybe through this particular question that I've phrased for them. So first, to May, how would international relations be changed with greater incorporation of Middle East perspectives? May, over to you.
Thank you, Tony, very much, and thank you for having me. So my contribution is going to be mainly focused on the Middle East. And in the few minutes that I've got, I would like to reflect a little bit on where the region is standing from the discipline at the moment, what can we do, and what are the challenges for that to happen. And just starting with, like, the IR discipline is conventionally known as an American social science. And that somewhat is reflected in where we publish, where the money's going to, who has more power in knowledge production, and so on and so forth. Recently, in the last couple of decades, there has been more attention to a reflective sort of thinking around these issues, that somewhat the IR discipline does not really reflect the whole humanity. It only reflects the interests, the views, but also the assumptions are built on the history of a certain part of the world. And therefore, many scholars started thinking, okay, how can we include voices from other parts of the world? How can we take into account the differences in regions, the differences across different countries? And therefore, there was rising debates on global IR, how to make IR more global, how to make IR somewhat more reflective of real issues around the globe. Somewhat the Middle East is one of the least represented regions in the IR discipline, and also one of the least represented regions in the global IR debate. So even though there has been advances to look at IR from Latin American perspective, from Asian perspective, from African perspective, the Middle East seems even behind on these kind of efforts. And somewhat this is a little bit puzzling, considering how the Middle East is full of international relations puzzles, but also historically provided some sort of a pool for cases to test many of the famous IR theories that we are using and teaching, and also have come to shape the debates in the IR discipline. So in a way, this is all very puzzling, and somewhat many of Middle Eastern scholars are more and more interested to engage in dialogues with the discipline, engage in dialogue of how the Middle East can be better represented in debates, can be better represented in publishing, in journals, but also in teaching. So it's not just about the research, it's also about the teaching that we do. And therefore, I can have like a few points of how the Middle East can enrich the IR discipline. The main way the Middle East has been used and can be still used as a way to be incorporated in the discipline by providing a host of case studies, which are very different from the case studies that are used in the West. And these case studies provide a hard test, a challenging test in the theoretical construct in the discipline. So many of the theories that have been developed still need testing, and they still need to show validity beyond their original cases. And somewhat the Middle East is really full of puzzling cases. And even like the current events and the richness of, I don't want to say wars and conflict, because that shouldn't be something positive, but the richness and the rapidity of change in the region as well provides an excellent pool of cases for many IR scholars to even consider having a different perspective on their theories, or even in their teaching. Unfortunately, many of the teaching is pretty much focused on the American sort of thinking, on the same assumption reproducing more or less the same cases, reproducing the US view on the world rather than the view of other regions. So somewhat including some of these cases from a different perspective can also enrich IR theory in different ways. Another way that could be also considered by scholars is looking at the Middle East as an area where theory could be developed. Again, the Middle East is very late and very behind on other regions in this. So we see many IR theories that have sort of been homegrown, emerging from different regions, emerging from Latin America, emerging from Asia. Like we talk about a Chinese IR, we talk about European IR, we talk about Latin American IR. The Middle East, unfortunately, it's one of the cases where we still don't have a homegrown theorizing. There are several attempts at creating or at developing a perspective on how theory could be developed from the region. But unfortunately, this has not really led to concrete sort of theories. It's more of an approach. It's more of a different way of saying things. So there are examples like the Beirut School of Security Studies. There's the example of the Islamic paradigm in IR, which again, they're not necessarily theories, the conventional way we look at theories, but they kind of have provided some sort of different thinking about the international from the region. So in a way, what we're still looking at is how the region can sort of provide this opportunity for developing theory, for producing knowledge in a different way, producing knowledge from a different perspective. And unfortunately, this is not very easy because knowledge production requires resources, requires institutions, requires obviously incentives, how scholars are sort of incentivized to work on these issues, which somewhat these kind of conditions are lacking in the Middle East, which make things even more challenging. And finally, and this is something that I would like to highlight, that also including and enriching the IR theory through Middle East cases does not really require that much effort. As academics, as researchers, every time we decide on a research question, every time we're designing a course to teach, we do have some sort of a responsibility, and we also have some sort of latitude in how to include different perspectives. And often we don't reflect enough on the main assumptions that we keep reproducing in our teaching and our research, and somewhat including different perspectives as well, different kind of scholars that have different backgrounds is also one way of enriching the IR discipline, because every scholar comes from a social, from an economic, from a political background that definitely affects the way they are socialized in the IR discipline. They're socialized in how they see the world around them, but also it shapes their choices of what they consider relevant, what's significant as a research question, as topics to study and to teach. So in a way, in that very brief contribution, I would like to say that there are many things that we could do to include different perspective in the IR discipline. And obviously that will enrich the discipline in many ways. Otherwise, IR is kind of risking to run as an ideology or as a narrative that's only focused on a certain part of the world and doesn't reflect the reality, aspirations, hopes of a large number of people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, May. That was terrific. A great way to start us off. Let me now turn to Joy. And the question I had posed to Joy, which is, what would the field of economic sanctions, something that you're an expert at, look like if Global South issues and authors had greater visibility and impact? Joy. Joy, you're muted. You're muted still.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Tony. The implementation of sanctions regimes has generally been done by the UN Security Council and by states in the global north. The US, EU, Canada, Australia, along with a few wealthy Asian nations such as South Korea and Japan. And I'm talking about the last 25, 30 years. There are a few exceptions, such as the African Union, and recently China and Russia have been actively engaged in the imposition of unilateral sanctions. But for the most part, unilateral sanctions are imposed by wealthy Western nations against countries in the South, or when they're imposed by the UN Security Council, they are highly shaped by the permanent members. At the same time, in the last 30 years, the academic field of economic sanctions has, for the most part, been shaped by scholars in the West, predominantly political scientists in the US, Europe, Canada, and a few other countries. I don't want to say that, for example, all sanctions scholars from the US hold the same views, but the academic literature produced by scholars from these countries has for years been dominated by a certain set of questions. How can sanctions achieve greater compliance by the targeted state or individual? How can sanctions enforcement be more effective? How can third parties be prevented from providing sanctions busting opportunities for the target state? How can banks and other private actors be made to take on the enforcement of sanctions? There are, of course, critiques coming out of these countries and this set of scholars who maintain, for example, that the likelihood of sanctions actually achieving the compliance of the target state is at best 1/3 of the time, and arguably is much lower, closer to only 5% of the time. Sanctions can significantly worsen the situation of the civilian population, as when they are imposed on autocrats. Sanctions are likely to trigger increased state repression and reduce the space for civil society and the media. And recently, there's been growing discussion of the humanitarian impact of sanctions. But it has always seemed to me that the sanctions field is, so to speak, missing its other half. Of course, the issues of compliance and enforcement are primary from the perspective of the sanctioner, but from the perspective of sanctioned countries, and for that matter, whole regions within the global South, the issues may look quite different. Their issues are not compliance or enforcement, but rather legality, legitimacy, and accountability. Cuba, for example, introduces an annual resolution at the UN General Assembly, maintaining that the US's unilateral measures against Cuba are in violation of international law. Each year, the overwhelming majority of the UN member states joins Cuba in this view. Last year, the vote was 185-2, the two being the US and Israel. We can say that there is, at the least, a plausible claim that these measures are in violation of international law. In the case of the UN Security Council measures against Iraq in the 1990s, it was clear that the human cost was enormous, with sanctions causing or contributing significantly to widespread malnutrition, epidemics of waterborne diseases, and the collapse of healthcare and education. This was because the Security Council measures were so broad as to be indiscriminate and disproportionate in violation of international humanitarian law. The same can be said of the current Security Council measures against North Korea, which target its major industries, its access to fuel, its access to international banking, to shipping, and to essential imports, such as all goods made of metal. In this case, while the Security Council concern is that North Korea continues to pursue its nuclear program, the other side of the equation has to do with the fact that the sanctions, in turn, have crippled North Korea's entire economy, its infrastructure, and its agricultural production, with a particular impact on food security, particularly in regard to those who are most vulnerable. So within the scholarship of economic sanctions, there are diverse viewpoints and active debates, but they overwhelmingly reflect the concerns of the Western countries that predominantly impose sanctions, issues such as compliance and enforcement. When we expand the range of our vision to encompass scholars and states that have experienced sanctions or are in the regions that are the most often the targets of sanctions, then we see different debates and different issues, particularly the questions of legality, legitimacy, and accountability. In my view, a global ethics of sanctions must expand its scope to include these perspectives.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joy. Again, really building upon your expertise and now trying to draw in some new insights. So thanks so much. Let me lastly turn to Raul. And I know, Raul, you've been working on issues around the rule of law. So the question I pose to you is, what do you see as some of the most significant and emerging rule of law issues in Latin America? Raul.
Thank you very much, Tony and Joy, for inviting me to the panel. And of course, thank you also to Carnegie Council for the opportunity to discuss this here. There are many issues actually which I have found in the literature, but also in the daily reflection about this topic in Latin America. So from the variety of issues regarding the rule of law in Latin America, I will highlight, or I will talk about three main issues, or most significant from my point of view so far. One is the security, but the security not in terms of international security, because the relationship between the states is more or less stable. What I actually mean here is the security in terms of the basic security of the human beings within the country, feeling free from danger of being assaulted or robbed or even killed. No, this is one of the major rule of law issues in the Latin American countries. The region with thousands and thousands of deaths of people as a result of crime per year. Latin America actually hosts various cities considered as the most dangerous of the planet, particularly in the big metropolitan cities of Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and also across the region. The trust in the role of the police to protect the integrity of the humans, as well as their private property, is really low. And that has to be with a second issue, which I wanted to talk about, the corruption. And the corruption in terms of misuse of power by governmental officials and civil servants for their own benefits, or in terms of bravery, being brave. At the different levels of the government, starting at the ministerial level, in the context of public bids for concessions within the oil or the mining industry, you can find many cases where you can see transnational and international corporations braving high governmental officials who pay poor or no attention to the human rights or indigenous rights or environmental rights. But this kind of behavior can also be found at the other institutional level, at the level of the police, military, the judiciary. And this has direct relation with the civil and criminal justice system, which is actually one of the major issues also of the rule of law in Latin America. And I'm talking in terms of being able to access or afford civil impartial justice. When corruption and insecurity is so high, and it's a high problem for the society, the poor people, the weaker, finds really difficult to access impartial justice. These issues are also related to the poor and the weak judiciary systems. Poor in the sense of lacking investment in infrastructure, in education, and in professionalization of the judge, and weak in the sense of lacking sufficient personnel to apply the law, lacking hence lacking credibility and support by the society. Of course, these issues also have to do with a final point, which I want to highlight. And actually, I think this kind of events like today, it's necessary to do more often and discuss, because academic research and debates about the meaning of the strong, stable rule of law, not only for democracy, but also for the well-being of the humans, is really poor in Latin America. So the majority of investigations have been carried out actually by European academics and North American academics and Canadian academics. There is some reflections on the rule of law, and particularly rights in the different areas of the discipline, but most of the time these are done within within law or within politics, but it's very, very seldom within the context of international relations. In general, there is a disbelief in the rule of law and the basic values of democracy within the region. Is somehow a perception of every time getting weaker is trust in the values of democracy. And as a consequence, it is possible to see that the people are turning to elect extremist and populist politicians who further weaken democracy. And this is really a concern because what we actually are looking for is trying to enforce and trying to reinforce and strengthen the values of democracy and the rule of law in the region.
Great. Thank you so much, Raul. I mean, you've raised so many interesting and important questions that I'm hoping we can get back to. So we have about, I'd say about 20, 25 more minutes. So one thing I'd say, please do, if you can, submit questions to from our global audience. If you can submit those via the chat, we'll try to bring those into our conversation if we have time. I'll also mention that Charlie, who we had hoped to include, Reverend Chiliufia, we haven't been able to get him on board here just for technical reasons. So apologies for that if you were hoping to hear from him. I've got a couple follow-up questions for each panelist. So let me do that, and I'll try to be brief. I don't want to take too much time. I'd rather hear your answer. So let me start with May. So thank you, May. And I know your scholarship is focused on international relations theory. And one of the things you did, which was to nicely suggest a couple schools of thought that are rising out of the Middle East, the Beirut School, an Islamic school. Now, of course, you know, the IR theory can be more explanatory and positivist than ethical, right? But by mentioning the Islamic school, I'm curious, could you maybe say a little bit, does that approach bring a consciously kind of ethical perspective to bear on international relations, at least? And I'm not an expert in that, but I don't know how much you know of it, but if maybe you could speak to that just briefly, tell us a little bit how does that school connect up ethics and global politics in some way?
Thank you, Tony, very much. So one of the main problems of that school that it has not been sufficiently developed in the same, like having particular assumptions or having particular theories, but the overarching sort of voice coming from that school is that somewhat the Islamic history of the region is crucial to understand its international relation, but also it's crucial to understand how states have interaction with the outside world. So they still have that division between Muslim, non-Muslim sort of spheres. And it is sort of looking at several other concepts which have been developed within the Islamic philosophy historically and trying to bring these concepts alive. So instead of thinking about the state, there is more thinking about ruler, there are more thinking about spheres of power, there are more thinking of civilization, and how these kind of concepts are still even alive. So the nation state is not the most important lens to understand international relations. in the region. So in a way, the school is coming from a different starting point, which is looking at the history of the region, looking at the history of Islam, some of its philosophy, to understand how it can inform some of the dynamics that we see in the region at the moment. As to whether the ethical aspect of it, again, I don't think it's that developed to address these particular questions, but it does somewhat advocate that the inequality that exists in our current world and how Islam kind of more or less advocates for a different perspective on justice, on equality, on different issues that more or less are discussed within this ethical sort of issues that we're discussing today. So in a way, the Islamic school, it's kind of taking a different position on some of these issues, and it's also trying to sort of bring a different perspective coming from the history of the region. Again, whether it's going to evolve into a more ethical perspective on IR or not, it's a little bit early to decide. It's also very early to judge whether this approach is going to develop into, let's say, it's a theoretical construct that would have validity beyond its initial thoughts or not. So obviously it has so many problems, it has so many criticism, but it is nevertheless an attempt, which we like it or not. It's just a different attempt at looking at the international relations.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. And I think that's really, it's interesting to hear about how the history is a kind of fundamental part of that emerging theoretical tradition. But certainly, as you mentioned, justice, such an important normative principle within Islam, you know, is something that I think in international affairs we often forget. We emphasize peace over justice too often. And I think that's an interesting way in which that voice could bring the centrality of justice to some of our ways of thinking about IR. So that's very interesting. And as you said, it's an emerging school, so it's maybe not fully developed yet, but we'll keep an eye on it. That's terrific. So let me shift over to Joy. Joy, you had at one point in your remarks toward the end, you had mentioned the centrality of legitimacy, legality, accountability. You also kind of frame things through international law, which of course is crucial. Can you tell us a little bit? I mean, how do those concepts? How does the wider international legal framework for you relate to the kind of the bringing more global voices, global South voices into the debates around sanctions? Again, you're muted. It's a Zoom problem for all of us now.
Yeah. So thank you, Tony. So again, the dominant issues we see are compliance, enforcement, the things that are of most concern for those imposing sanctions, for those who are the target of them or those who are affected by them directly or indirectly. Certainly one of the issues that keeps rising to the fore is legality. And that's particularly significant in the case of unilateral coercive measures. There are some circumstances under which unilateral economic sanctions are permissible, countermeasures, retorsion, so on. But arguably, and I think it's quite interesting to look at the work of Elena Duhan, the UN Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, to see that there are really substantial concerns about whether and when unilateral coercive measures are legal. And so I'm thinking in particular of regime change. So when sanctions are imposed for the purpose of regime change, well, that prima facie seems to run counter to Article 2 of the UN Charter and just the primacy of sovereignty that's so well established under international law. And then I think if we also look at international humanitarian law, we see both for UN Security Council measures and unilateral measures, this recurring issue of being indiscriminate and disproportionate. So as we all know from just war doctrine and IHL, measures cannot be imposed on a civilian population that indiscriminately affect a civilian population or vulnerable populations that cannot disproportionately affect those who are not combatants. And I think what we see really in the patterns over and over again for the last 20 years, certainly during the Iraq sanctions, but also even in the ostensible period of targeted sanctions, we see sanctions that are really geared towards systems. So undermining all imports, all exports, access to all banking, access to fuel, access to insurance, which then affects all shipping and so on. So that we really then see measures that are by their nature going to be both indiscriminate and disproportionate. So for example, if you undermine a country's access to fuel, which is the case in many cases right now, well, that's going to affect all of the country's infrastructure, and in particular, its capacity for electricity and for gasoline. So if you don't have sufficient electricity and gasoline, if you don't have sufficient electricity, that affects water treatment, it affects industrial production. If you don't have gasoline, that affects food distribution, it affects city buses. All of these then in turn have a consequence on employment, and on and on and on. So I think that what needs to happen is a much more extensive discussion of looking at the lens of international humanitarian, in terms of legal issues, international humanitarian law, and also the legal question of when, if ever, unilateral coercive measures geared toward regime change can be considered legal.
Great. Thanks so much, Joy. And again, with your expertise on this topic, it's very helpful to hear your insights on this. We are getting some questions into the chat, but let me first pose one follow-up to Raul, who, as with all of you, raised some terrific questions. So Raul, one of the things you had mentioned was about rights, particularly, you mentioned in passing indigenous rights and kind of human rights more broadly. So some, right, claim that human rights are an imposition on the rest of the world coming from a particular northern perspective. Can you give us your thoughts on, because of course indigenous rights is a collective right, something that's evolved in more recent years through the human rights discourse and scholarship. Can you tell us a little bit, how do you, in your position from where you sit, how do you view human rights? Is it an imposition? Is it something that we all should have access to? Tell me a little bit what's your thoughts there. I know it's a big question, but what do you think?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tony, for the question. I've been thinking about this just about this issue, and I think there are some elemental rights which are universal rights, where every culture actually come together, like the right for living, drinking, water access to water, to food, which actually enables the human to survive. There are the human rights which for everybody, I think in all the cultures is universal. But there are collective rights which are based in cultural elements as well. Like in South America, the Andean cultures, these cultures go back to their ancestors, to their belief, how should society organize politically. These are different kind of rights, but there are rights also that are very important for them because enables them to organize themselves with their own identity. And that is the problem when transnationals, multinationals brave governmental officials and don't care about these principles, which actually enables them to organize themselves and maintain themselves as they think. And that is an ethical principle which is actually been, I would say, not attended, not taken into account. In that context, talking about culture and the diversity, I want to actually to highlight what Harry Gold said about talking still in English and not paying attention to the other multi-linguistic elements. No?
Well, let me before you mention that, Raul, let me just, and then I'll come back to you. You can answer this one first. So this is a question from the chat. Harry Gould, who is a professor at Florida International University and is a longtime friend of the council. Let me read his question and then let me get your response, Raul, and others on the panel. So Harry asks, I find it quite telling that we're still having this conversation in English. Maybe monolingual English speakers are the ones who need most to be told these things, but it would be nice to move to a condition in which we can have these conversations about being more global multilingually. So Raul, please, back to you. What's your response to that?
I was going to highlight that this is an issue that even within the academia is being a problem. And I wanted to highlight that because in the last 3 or 4 years, we have been asking ISA to enable panels in Spanish, for example, to have panels in Spanish, because not everybody is able to talk in English or understand English. And unfortunately, that is a problem which we need to reflect collectively. And it's the same, it's a natural problem which we can perhaps try to change in the sense that we enable the others to understand through translator, interpreters, because it is necessary to talk or to show the diversity, because this is a cultural element, and I come back to this cultural, these are collective rights which we can see as a problem, being a huge problem in Latin America and South America particularly, and not really taking so much into account these other cultural elements which are there, which are important, which ethically are very important for these collectivities. And I think when we are in the process, we are trying to do that, but it can't be changed immediately. It is necessary to have a dialogue within the North or the South, within the collectivities, these indigenous peoples and their principles, and also within the ethics of the transnationals, what they are looking for, and the politicians in the middle, of course.
Yes, yeah, great. Thank you, Raul. I know, Joy, you tried in some of your own work to encourage translation into English of scholars from around the world. I don't know if you want to speak to this question, and then I'll put it to May as well.
Well, sure. So I think there's lots of issues having to do with publishing the work of Global South scholars. And just to put in a little bit of a plug, if I may, Tony and I are the co-series editors for Palgrave Macmillan's series Global Ethics. And we have designed that specifically to be a platform for the work of Global South scholars, or in dialogue with Global North and South on issues of concern and emanating from the Global South. So we invite submissions and proposals for that. But I think there's lots of issues. One is access to journal databases, which are very expensive, proprietary. You find them in almost all US universities. And in Latin America and in Africa and in other parts of the world, they're unaffordable or inaccessible. We see lots of other issues, for example, open access, which seems like it would be something that would help avoid this problem of the proprietary databases. And in fact, it has a very asymmetric effect because it's expensive to publish something that's open access. Then the resources available in the North then make it possible for North scholars to get their work even more broadly read, and then the reverse is not true. Issues of visas, for example, for the ISA, for LASA, for in general conferences held in the US. I can't speak to how this works in Europe or Canada, but for example, with Latin American Studies Association, for years there would be a problem with Cuban scholars, and Cuba has a very robust academic infrastructure, being able to get visas to attend. So there are just so many impediments of different sorts. I think what's needed is on the part of journals like Ethics and International Affairs, which I think has been so committed to this something like Palgrave Macmillan, ISA, and others, a concerted effort to think of all the different issues there are in what inclusion would actually look like, and what I would say the other half of the field, whatever the fields are, would look like.
Good, thanks, Joy. May, I mean, I can say that I taught at the American University in Cairo years and years ago, and my Arabic was shwaya, not that great. So I'd be interested from your perspective. Of course, in the Middle East regions, we've got Turkish, we've got Hebrew, we've got Arabic. But maybe can you speak to this from your perspective, this question of language and how important it is?
I think I totally agree with Joy about this kind of the structural conditions of knowledge production that definitely inhibits this communication in other languages. Like, I speak and I can teach and I can write academically in 3 languages, but I still do everything in English. And that is telling something, because to get a job, to be able to publish, and there's more focus on high profile journals, high impact journals. It's just the whole system is structured in a way to incentivize speaking in English, writing in English, publishing in English. But definitely that excludes a large number of scholarly debates. In the Middle East in particular, there are many academic literature that's in Arabic, and it hardly gets cited. It hardly gets to part of the debates within the published work, because it's simply not accessible to American scholars or European scholars. And those who write in Arabic, they're unable to publish in English. So most of that knowledge is lost in between, and it's not really communicated. So what we have published in the academic journals are mostly the American, the Western perspective on the Middle East. But the regional perspective on the Middle East is not really visible in the academic debates because they're simply in a different language, let alone the challenges of teaching and sort of speaking to a whole different audience of students from the region, which is not really a small number. We're talking about a large number of students that research can influence. And we will find that most of the textbooks are written in English. Most of the textbooks are not translated into Arabic. There are no resources to translate that kind of knowledge into Arabic. So we have some sort of a complete divide between knowledge production in the West and knowledge production in the Middle East. And there are no even channels for communication. What makes matters even worse is that there is a huge gap that's increasing in investment in education in the Arab world. So that gap that already exists is increasing day by day because authoritarian governments are not interested in investing in education. Higher education institution in the region have a whole sort of crises and problems that inhibits any kind of investment. And they have a totally different sort of incentive structure for academics there. So there is a whole different world. So, and that is the challenge. How do we bring all of this into a global sort of perspective if there is a complete disconnect and lack of communication on every level?
Yes. Thanks, May. That's really insightful. So unfortunately, we're running out of time. We're not quite out of time yet. And there's some terrific questions posed in the chat. What I'm going to do is the following, just a quick mention of a few here. So from Dr. Acharya, would you briefly explain the present challenges of global ethics and how far it may contribute to a better world? Mikhail Tice has a longer question. I'm just going to summarize. Looking for more creative, arts-based approaches to culture and how might those help us thinking more globally? A really insightful question. A question from Stephanie about highlighting the way in which religious traditions such as Islam, since that's the one we mentioned, justice thinking in that culture has shown itself can be sometimes extreme in relationships to other religious traditions or can inflame conflict, I guess is what she's getting to there. Eugene Mohammed asked a great question. What ethical orientations might we adopt that will facilitate our transcendence of not just our Western centered perspectives, but our anthropocentric ethical tendencies as well? crucial question with climate change, deforestation, animal rights, really important. And then a question from Hana Mubarak: is it possible to have a working system of ethical IR when cultural milieus, which are often influenced by religion, vary from region to region? So a couple on kind of questions around religion, which we really didn't kind of address directly, but came up through the mention that May noted for us. So I don't know, we've got just a couple minutes left. I don't know if maybe each of you, if there's any of those questions you want to respond to, just take maybe a minute or two, or if there's any kind of summary point you want to make. Again, just a minute, because we have to end in probably 2-3 minutes. So let me first go to Raul. Raul, did you have any kind of last thoughts you'd like to add?
I think that some of the questions have been very encouraging, particularly in the sense that we need more conversation, dialogue, translation, reflection collectively, taking into account the variety of cultures and ethics and the ways of thinking on living. No, it's very important to continue doing.
Good. Okay, May?
Thank you very much. I'm just gonna look at the question on religion and just a very brief comment on that, because I would need more time to go into detail. But looking at the history, the role of religion in international relation is somewhat not just specific to Islam. There were other religions as well in other historical periods that led to injustices, that led to extremist ideas, even authoritarianism and wars. So I think looking at that particular question, we need to look at the role of religion in general and how sacred ideas can have a positive, negative impact on our debates of ethics. And that's how I would look at that question a little bit differently. Thank you.
Great. No, that's terrific. Thank you, May. Joy?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to emphasize the importance of being very intentional of our field, our journals, our knowledge production institutions being very intentional about what inclusion requires and making that come about. So that may happen by having facilities for greater translation, for providing in some fashion access to the journal databases. But I think mainly thinking that it's this failure, this kind of a failure of our field is problematic in two regards. One is that the field itself is kind of deformed. I sort of feel like we're missing half of the field. And the other is that as a matter of both collegiality and justice, there's an obligation of inclusion. So I think we need to reframe it that way, and then think about what are the institutional resources and processes that then must be put in place to implement this commitment.
Great. Thank you so much, Joy. And so let me end here, although hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of one. And thank you so much for all the terrific questions we had in the chat. And I'm sure there's others out there. I hope you can contact us individually. Please do so. But let me thank my panelists. First of all, outstanding reflections and insights. Thank you so much. I'm just sorry we couldn't get Charlie on board. And maybe in a future iteration of this, we will. And I hope that's the case. And before we do sign off, I want to remind everybody that you can access a recording of this event and find out more from on Global Ethics Day by visiting carnegiecouncil.org. So that's all one word, carnegiecouncil.org. And I think that's it from us. So thanks so much for joining us, and we hope you gain some interesting insights from this.